Thanksgiving was supposed to smell like sage and butter, like comfort and old memories stitched together with laughter. Instead, it smelled like judgment. I had arrived early, as I always did, with 2 pies I'd baked myself and a quiet hope that maybe this year would feel different. My son barely looked up from his phone when I walked in. His wife, my daughter-in-law, gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I should have known then. The air was already tight, like a room holding its breath. When everyone finally gathered, plates clinking, chairs scraping the floor, she stood at the head of the table. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't hesitate. She looked straight at me and said, "You don't deserve to sit at the table with us." The room froze. Forks hovered midair. My son stared at his plate. No one defended me. Not one person. She added that it was family only, and somehow in her mind I didn't qualify. She pointed to a small folding table near the kitchen, the one usually reserved for kids. I felt something crack inside me, but I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I quietly picked up my pies, placed them back into the carrier, and walked out. I heard a few uncomfortable coughs behind me, but no one followed. That silence told me everything I needed to know. For years, I had been the invisible support beam. The one who helped with down payments, who watched the kids for free, who paid small loans that were never repaid. I had put my own life on pause so theirs could move faster. And in one sentence, she made it clear my value ended where their convenience did. So I went home, sat alone at my own table, and made a decision. I wasn't going to scream or beg for respect. I was going to change quietly, completely. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I reviewed documents I hadn't looked at in years. The house deed, the trust I'd set up for my grandchildren, the emergency fund I'd let my son access, just in case. I didn't do anything dramatic, I just tightened every loose thread. Names were removed. Access was limited. Conditions were clarified. What had once been open-handed became structured and protected. Then I stopped answering calls immediately. I became busy. I stopped volunteering to help. When they asked for favors, I said I couldn't, calmly, kindly, no explanations. I let them feel the weight of my absence without ever announcing it. Weeks passed. Then months. Without my financial cushion, things started to wobble. Childcare costs added up. Bills piled higher. The small emergencies turned into big ones. I heard through mutual relatives that they were stressed, snapping at each other, overwhelmed. Still, no apology came. Pride is expensive like that. I used the time to rebuild myself. I traveled. I redecorated my home. I laughed with friends who saw me, not used me. I stopped feeling guilty for choosing myself. The quiet became healing. 3 months later, my phone rang late at night. It was my son. His voice was tired, stripped of the confidence he'd borrowed for years. He asked if we could talk. When I arrived the next day, they were both there, sitting, waiting. Smaller somehow. She spoke first. Her voice trembled. She said they didn't mean it like that. That Thanksgiving had been stressful. That family says things. Then she cried. Real tears. The kind meant to fix things. My son said they needed me. That the kids missed me. That they wanted things back to normal. He finally looked at me then. Really looked. I listened. I let the silence stretch the way it had stretched for me that day. Then I told them the truth. I said that words spoken publicly carve scars privately. That respect isn't seasonal. That a table means nothing if dignity isn't served with the meal. I told them I wasn't angry anymore, but I was done being small to make others comfortable. They asked what they could do. I said nothing dramatic, just boundaries. Clear ones. Apologies without excuses, respect without conditions, and an understanding that my support was a gift, not a guarantee. They agreed. Quickly. Desperately. I stood up to leave, and my daughter-in-law asked if I'd stay for dinner. She gestured to the table, the big one. I smiled softly and said, "Not tonight." Because the most powerful revenge isn't watching someone beg. It's knowing you no longer need their approval to stand tall. The moment didn't arrive with a scream or a slap. It came dressed as politeness, wrapped in a smile sharp enough to cut. Thanksgiving had always been complicated, but I still believed in showing up, in bringing food, in keeping traditions alive even when they felt one-sided. I arrived early that day, like I always did, hands full with dishes I'd spent hours preparing, heart full of a quiet hope that maybe this year would be different. The house buzzed with activity, voices overlapping, chairs being dragged across the floor, the television murmuring in the background. I greeted everyone warmly, but the warmth never quite came back to me. My son hugged me quickly, distracted, already halfway back into another conversation. My daughter-in-law gave me a tight smile, the kind that looks friendly from far away but feels cold up close. I told myself not to read into it. I had learned to do that over the years, excuse small slights, swallow awkward moments, tell myself family was family and effort mattered. I set my dishes down, helped in the kitchen, cleaned where I wasn't asked to, stayed out of the way. I had become very good at being useful without being visible. When it was time to eat, everyone gathered around the table. It was a big table, carefully set, with matching plates and folded napkins. I stood there for a moment, waiting to see where I should sit, feeling oddly like a guest in a place I had helped build. That's when she cleared her throat. The room went quiet, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. She looked straight at me, not angry, not emotional, just certain. "You don't deserve to sit at the table with us," she said. The words landed heavy, like a dish dropped on tile. For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. People don't usually say things like that out loud, not in front of others, not on a holiday meant for gratitude. But then she kept going. She said it was for immediate family only. She said it would be better if I used the small folding table in the kitchen, the one usually set up for kids or overflow. She gestured to it casually, like she was doing me a favor. I looked around the room, waiting for someone, anyone, to laugh awkwardly and correct her, to say she was joking, to step in and say that wasn't okay. My son stared down at his plate, suddenly very interested in the pattern on it. Other relatives avoided my eyes. No one spoke. In that silence, the humiliation deepened. It wasn't just what she said, it was the collective agreement not to challenge it. My face burned, but I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. Something inside me went very still. In that moment, I understood something with painful clarity. This wasn't about a chair or a table. It was about how they saw me. About how small they thought I was willing to be. I thought about all the times I had been there without being asked. The weekends I'd spent babysitting so they could rest. The money I'd lent when things were tight. The holidays I'd rearranged my own plans for theirs. The advice I'd offered gently and the insults I'd swallowed quietly. I realized that none of it had earned me respect, only expectation. So I picked up my dishes. The room stayed silent as I placed them back into the carrier. I didn't rush. I didn't slam anything. I walked out the door with my head high and my hands steady. Even though my chest felt hollow, no one followed me. No one called out. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded final. I drove home in a fog, the words replaying in my mind over and over again. "You don't deserve." They echoed louder than any argument could have. When I reached my house, I set the food down on my own table and sat there alone. The quiet was overwhelming at first, but then it became revealing. I wasn't lonely in that moment. I was clear. That public humiliation stripped away every illusion I'd been clinging to. It showed me exactly where I stood and how easily I could be discarded when it suited them. And while the pain of that realization hurt deeply, it also did something else. It freed me. Because once someone shows you they don't value you, you stop wasting energy trying to prove your worth to them. That Thanksgiving didn't break me. It marked the end of a version of me, the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace, who accepted less to avoid conflict, who believed love meant endurance. Walking away from that table was the first time I chose dignity over familiarity, self-respect over approval. And even though I didn't know it yet, that moment, standing alone while everyone else stayed seated, was the beginning of everything changing. I didn't plan anything that night. There was no dramatic vow, no written list of changes, no angry phone calls or ultimatums. I went to bed feeling heavy but strangely calm, as if my body had made a decision before my mind caught up. The humiliation from Thanksgiving still sat in my chest, but instead of turning into rage, it settled into clarity. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to ask a question I had always avoided. What if I simply stopped trying so hard? The next morning, I woke up and noticed something unfamiliar: silence. No early message asking if I could watch the kids. No reminder about a bill that needed covering. Just until next month. No casual expectation that I would rearrange my day to fix someone else's problem. Normally, I would feel anxious in that quiet, as if I had forgotten something important. Instead, I made coffee slowly and sat by the window, letting the quiet exist without filling it. Over the years, I had become predictable, always available, always understanding. always ready to smooth things over. And predictability had made me easy to dismiss. I realized then that nothing would change unless I did, and change didn't need to be loud to be effective. I began with small, almost invisible adjustments. When my son called later that week and hinted that childcare was expensive, I listened kindly and said I was busy. I didn't explain what I was busy with. I didn't apologize. The pause on the other end of the line was brief but telling. He wasn't used to hearing that from me. I went through my finances with a level of seriousness I'd never applied before. Not because I was angry, but because I finally understood the difference between generosity and self-erasure. I noticed how often temporary help had become permanent access. How boundaries I'd meant to set years ago were postponed in the name of family harmony. Quietly, carefully, I corrected that. I canceled automatic transfers. I changed permissions. I made sure that help required a conversation, not an assumption. What surprised me most was how peaceful it felt. I had expected guilt to crash over me in waves, but it didn't. Instead, there was relief. For years, I had carried the emotional and financial weight of everyone else's comfort, mistaking that burden for love. Letting go of it felt like putting down a heavy bag I didn't realize I'd been dragging. I also stopped initiating contact. Not as a punishment, but as an experiment. I wanted to see what happened when I didn't fill every silence, didn't check in to make sure everyone was okay. Days passed, then weeks. Messages became shorter, calls less frequent. It was painful, yes, but it was honest. I was finally seeing the relationship as it truly was, not as I wished it to be. With the extra time and energy, I turned inward. I revisited parts of myself I had neglected for years. I met friends for coffee without watching the clock. I took long walks without my phone buzzing in my pocket. I redecorated my living room simply because I wanted to, not because someone else needed the space for something. These were small acts, but they stitched me back together in ways I hadn't expected. There were moments of doubt. Nights when I wondered if I was being too cold, too distant. I replayed the Thanksgiving scene in my mind, the way no one had spoken up for me, and the doubt faded. Boundaries weren't cruelty. They were self-respect, long overdue. Gradually, I noticed a shift. Conversations changed tone. Requests became more careful, less entitled. There was a hesitation now, a recognition that my presence was no longer guaranteed. And in that hesitation, something else emerged: respect. Not the warm, affectionate kind I once craved, but a quieter, more real version. I never announced my change. I didn't demand apologies or explanations. I simply lived differently. And in doing so, I reclaimed something I had lost long before Thanksgiving: control over my own life. The quiet decisions I made in the weeks that followed didn't just alter how others treated me. They changed how I saw myself. I was no longer a background figure in someone else's story. I had stepped forward into my own, and for the first time in a long while, it felt solid beneath my feet. By the time 3 months had passed, the silence that once felt empowering had turned heavy on their side, not mine. I hadn't noticed the exact moment it happened, but something had shifted in the balance between us. Where there used to be confidence, almost arrogance, there was now hesitation. Where requests once came wrapped in assumption, they now arrived cautiously, like someone testing thin ice. It started with small things. A message from my son asking how I was, not followed by a favor. Then another, a few days later, asking if I might be free sometime soon. The tone was different, softer, less certain. I replied politely but vaguely, keeping my answers short, not out of spite, but because I was no longer filling space just to ease someone else's discomfort. Each interaction felt like watching someone realize, slowly, that the ground beneath them was no longer solid. I heard through relatives that things were difficult. Childcare costs were higher than expected. Work schedules clashed. Bills that had once been manageable were suddenly overwhelming. Arguments were more frequent. Stress had a way of pulling the truth to the surface, and the truth was this: they had built their life assuming my support would always be there. When it disappeared, even quietly, everything wobbled. One evening, my phone rang late. I almost didn't answer. Something told me this call would be different. When I picked up, my son's voice sounded tired in a way I'd never heard before, stripped of certainty, stripped of pride. He didn't jump straight into what he wanted. He asked how I was doing. There was an awkward pause, like he wasn't sure how to speak to me anymore. He said they were having a hard time, that things had piled up, that they missed me. He didn't mention Thanksgiving, not directly, but it hung between us, unspoken and heavy. I listened without interrupting. When he finally asked if we could talk in person, his voice cracked just enough to tell me this wasn't casual. When I arrived at their house the next day, both of them were waiting. They didn't sit comfortably. There was no casual small talk. The confidence my daughter-in-law once carried like armor was gone. She looked smaller somehow, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence felt familiar, but this time it wasn't mine to carry. She spoke first. Her apology didn't come out smoothly. It was uneven, emotional, layered with justification and regret tangled together. She said she'd been stressed, that she hadn't meant it the way it sounded. That family sometimes hurts each other without meaning to. Tears followed. Real ones, not dramatic, but desperate. She said she hadn't realized how much I did until I stopped doing it. My son followed, his words simpler. He said they needed me. Not just practically, but emotionally. He admitted they'd taken me for granted. He said the kids kept asking why I wasn't around as much. That hit harder than anything else. I let them speak. I didn't rush to reassure them. I didn't soften the moment. I needed them to sit with it, the way I had sat alone at my own table months earlier. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me. It was calm, steady. There was no anger left to fuel it, only truth. I told them that being humiliated publicly changes something deep inside a person. That when respect is taken away in front of others, it doesn't come back easily. I explained that I hadn't stepped back to punish them. I stepped back because I finally understood my worth. I told them I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't the same person who walked out of that Thanksgiving dinner either. They asked what they could do to fix it. That question mattered, not because it erased what happened, but because it acknowledged responsibility. I told them I wasn't interested in grand gestures or emotional promises. What I needed were boundaries that would be respected, not challenged. Gratitude that wasn't spoken only when things went wrong. And an understanding that my presence in their lives was a privilege, not a resource to be used up. They agreed quickly, almost desperately. I could see the fear behind their nods, the fear of losing something they'd assumed was permanent. And in that moment, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that I had done the right thing. As I stood to leave, my daughter-in-law asked if I'd stay for dinner. She gestured toward the table, the same table. This time, there was no question of where I would sit. I paused, smiled gently, and declined. Not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed that seat to feel whole. Walking away again on my own terms felt different. Stronger. Because the real victory wasn't their apology or their need. It was the fact that I could choose myself without fear. And that was something no one could ever take away from me again. Forgiveness didn't arrive as a sudden, dramatic release. It came slowly, unevenly, like learning to walk on a leg that had once been broken. After that conversation, after the apologies and the promises, there was a strange new phase, one I hadn't anticipated. Everyone assumed that because I listened, because I didn't shout or slam doors, everything was fixed. But healing isn't a switch you flip, it's a practice, and it requires honesty, especially with yourself. In the weeks that followed, I kept my distance, not physically, but emotionally. I showed up when I chose to. I stayed for shorter visits. I left before exhaustion or resentment could creep in. This wasn't punishment, it was protection. For the first time in my life, I was paying attention to how interactions made me feel instead of how they made others comfortable. At first, they struggled with that. My son would ask why I couldn't stay longer. My daughter-in-law would offer overly enthusiastic kindness, the kind that feels more like compensation than care. I accepted it politely, but I didn't reward it by overgiving. I wasn't interested in trading one unhealthy pattern for another. The hardest part was resisting the urge to slide back into my old role. When the kids got sick and childcare plans fell apart, every instinct in me screamed to rush in and fix everything. That had been my identity for so long, reliable, self-sacrificing, always there. But this time I paused, I helped when I genuinely could, and I said no when it cost me too much. Each no felt uncomfortable, but it also felt honest. And honesty, I was learning, was kinder than resentment. Something unexpected happened as a result. My son began stepping up in ways he hadn't before. Not perfectly, not all at once, but noticeably. When help wasn't guaranteed, he learned how much effort things actually required. When solutions didn't magically appear, he had to create them. That growth wouldn't have happened if I'd rushed back in to save the day. My daughter-in-law changed too, though more slowly. Respect, I realized, can't be demanded, it has to be learned, often through loss. She became more careful with her words, more thoughtful with her tone. There were moments when I could tell she wanted to revert to control, to authority, but she stopped herself. That restraint spoke louder than any apology. As for me, the biggest change was internal. I no longer measured my worth by how needed I was. I stopped feeling anxious when my phone stayed quiet. I stopped over-explaining my choices. I stopped shrinking to keep the peace. These shifts weren't always visible to others, but they transformed my inner world completely. There were still moments of grief. I mourned the relationship I thought we had, the fantasy of unconditional appreciation I'd clung to for years. Letting go of that dream hurt, but it also made room for something more real, something grounded in mutual respect rather than obligation. One afternoon, while sitting alone with a cup of tea, it hit me. This was the real revenge. Not their apologies, not their struggle, not even their eventual understanding. The real power was that I no longer needed validation from the very people who once dismissed me. I wasn't waiting to be invited to the table anymore. I had built my own. When they asked for more time, more help, more closeness, I evaluated each request without guilt. Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it wasn't. Either way, I slept peacefully at night. That peace was new, and it was precious. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what happened. It meant remembering it without letting it define me. It meant choosing myself even when it felt unfamiliar. And most of all, it meant understanding that love without boundaries isn't love, it's surrender. I hadn't changed to hurt them. I had changed to save myself. And in doing so, I taught them a lesson no argument ever could. Respect grows where self-respect is planted. The final lesson didn't arrive with applause or closure the way movies pretend it does. There was no triumphant moment where everyone suddenly understood my worth and spoke it aloud. Instead, it unfolded quietly in ordinary moments, the kind that once would have gone unnoticed by me because I was too busy proving myself. That was how I knew it was real. Months after everything changed, I found myself sitting alone at my kitchen table one evening, not waiting for a call, not replaying conversations in my head, not bracing for the next request. The calm I felt then was deeper than relief. It was ownership. My time was mine. My energy was mine. My choices were mine. For the first time in decades, I wasn't living on standby. When my son and daughter-in-law reached out now, it was different. Their words were careful, but not fearful. Respectful, but not performative. They asked instead of assumed. They listened instead of defending. Sometimes they still stumbled. Old habits don't die easily, but I no longer felt responsible for correcting them. If a comment crossed a line, I addressed it calmly. If a request felt wrong, I declined without explanation, and the world didn't end. What surprised me most was how little I needed their approval anymore. I had spent so many years chasing harmony that I confused it with love. I believed if I just gave more, bent more, stayed quieter, things would eventually feel right. But harmony built on self-erasure is fragile. It collapses the moment someone decides you're inconvenient. Now, I wasn't chasing harmony. I was living in alignment. And that changed everything. There were moments when my daughter-in-law looked at me with a kind of uncertainty, as if she were still recalibrating who I was allowed to be. I didn't fill that space for her. I let her adjust on her own. Power doesn't need to announce itself. It shows up consistently and lets others respond to it however they will. My son changed too, though not because I lectured him. He changed because the safety net he'd leaned on was no longer automatic. He learned to carry weight he'd never had to before. Sometimes he thanked me for my help in ways that felt genuine, not transactional. Sometimes he didn't. Either way, I no longer kept score. My giving was a choice now, not a role. The grandchildren noticed the shift in their own way. They sensed that I wasn't rushing anymore, that I wasn't exhausted or distracted when I was with them. I was present, fully. And presence, I learned, mattered more than availability ever did. There were people who didn't understand my transformation. Some relatives whispered that I had changed, as if that were a flaw. I smiled when I heard that. Change was the point. Staying the same was what had hurt me. The most powerful realization came one afternoon when I was invited formally, politely, to a family gathering. The message ended with, "We'd love to have you, but we understand if you're busy." I stared at my phone for a long moment. Not because I felt torn, but because I felt free. I chose to go. Not because I needed to belong, but because I wanted to be there. When I arrived, no one told me where to sit. They didn't need to. I chose my place naturally, without hesitation, without waiting for permission. No one questioned it. No one dared to. And even if they had, I realized it wouldn't have shaken me, because my worth no longer depended on a chair at someone else's table. That was the true revenge, though revenge no longer felt like the right word. It wasn't about them feeling sorry or struggling or begging. It was about me waking up to my own value so completely that their behavior lost the power to define me. I didn't win by taking something from them. I won by giving myself back to myself. I learned that dignity is quiet, boundaries are powerful, and self-respect doesn't need witnesses. The woman who walked out of that Thanksgiving dinner was wounded but awakening. The woman who stood months later was steady, unafraid, and unmovable. And the best part, I didn't need anyone's permission to become her.